Kim Hamilton asked us to have a kōrero about Census 2018 implications for Māori and also data sovereignty and iwi data sovereignty. So I thought I'll just set the context first by talking a little bit about Census 2018. Primarily talking about this in my capacity as an academic at the University of Waikato, but also acknowledging that I have a strong involvement in Te Mana Rārunga, which is the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end of my kōrero. And also was a member of the External Data Quality Panel, which released a report a couple of weeks ago on data quality relating to Census 2018. So I think it's useful to remind ourselves how census data are actually used, and they're used for many purposes. They're used for electoral boundaries and for electoral seats. So census data has constitutional implications. Census data are used to produce data that are used for monitoring our treaty obligations and also for equity purposes. And we know that equity is a significant social issue here in Aotearoa, particularly for our Māori and Pacific peoples. Census data are used to allocate population-based funding for DHBs, and in the past there have been some DHBs who have been concerned with census undercounts that has impacted the population funding that has come to the DHB. Kiri will talk about iwi census data in more depth, so I won't linger on that, but suffice to say that the census is the sole source of comprehensive iwi data, and that it's used extensively by iwi to inform planning, to inform development, for advocacy, and is also used in settlements as well. Census data are used to rebase population estimates and projections, so the estimated resident population is rebased on the most recent census, and then that ERP is often used as a denominator for important population rates that we use to understand how circumstances and disease states are changing for different population groups over time. The census data are also used for population projections, which local councils rely on in order to do their planning and their short-term, medium-term and long-term planning. So those projections are really important. One of the most important things about the census is that it counts everybody in the population. And so that's really the job of the census. Well, that's the job of Stats New Zealand, and that's the point of the census, is to count everybody who's usually resident. And what it does that other surveys doesn't do is that it gives us an insight into communities, and it captures small groups, and it captures small areas that other surveys can't do. So the census is really important in that regard, providing that really granular detail, which is the sole source. Also beyond matters of funding allocation and the kind of research purposes, what the census does is that it shapes our public perceptions of who we are as a nation and where we're heading. And that public perception part is also really important. So it is the most important government data collection, and we rely on it very heavily for a whole range of purposes, which is why it's so important to get it right. And it's particularly important to get it right for those groups who are most affected by issues such as equity. So if you can put your mind back to June 2018, there were some early signs of a census crisis, and some concerns that the census hadn't gone to plan, and that the data quality may not be as good as we would expect it to be. Te Mana Rārunga, which is a Māori Data Sovereignty group, were quite quick to respond. In July 2018, last year, TMR put out a press release and a 10-page technical statement outlining their concerns about Census 2018, what the implications might be for Māori, and wanting some answers to some questions. And this slide just shows some of the newspaper response to that statement by TMR, and kind of beginning to raise some questions about what was going on with the census, and what does this actually mean for Māori, and what does this mean for iwi. Kia ora, Kim. There was always also a response from Māori as academics. My colleague and I, who's in Dr. Donna Cormack, who's at Otago University, Wellington, and also Auckland University, we wrote a paper in the New Zealand Population Review on Census 2018 and implications for Māori. And there we were particularly concerned about a low Māori response rate. We didn't have any figures, but we estimated that the response rate could be around 80%, and in some areas down to 70%, and that was an issue of grave concern to us. And also a paper written recently, and these are the URLs, in Ko Tuatui, which is the New Zealand Journal of Social Sciences, talking about issues of social and cultural licence and the need for Māori data governance. And then we also served on the External Data Quality Panel. So just to fast forward this a little bit and get to some of the nitty-gritty about the census, which I'm just assuming that not everybody has read the 98-page report from the Data Quality Panel or necessarily knows all the detailed data around that. But the response rate is really important. That's one of the areas that we were most concerned about at the outset. And you can see here in the 2013 census that the total New Zealand response rate for the total population in all parts of the country was 93%. For Māori in 2013, it was just short of 90%, and then for Pacific peoples, it was 91%. Now, if you look at 2018, the response rates there, you see quite a different story. So if we look at the collection response rate to individual forms from the 2018 census, only of the final census data file, only 68% of Māori in the final census data set answered that through the individual form, and for Pacific people it was even lower at 65%. So that's massively different from the total New Zealand population, which was 83%. If we take account of partial forms, so this is the dwellings forms where you've only got partial information, so that will be the name, sex, and or the address. 6% of Māori were drawn from the partial form, and that's 88% for Pacific people, but the ethnicity data had to come from somewhere else. So you can see there that the response rates are much lower than the previous 2013 census and censuses before that. So just to fast forward to the key findings from the independent data quality panel, and the full report can be found on the Stats New Zealand website. There were some key findings there. So one was that they endorsed the methodologies used, and that the Māori descent variable that's used to calculate the number of Māori seats and general seats did actually meet the accuracy requirements. So that was one of the concerns initially raised by Te Manararanga and others, is that the poor response rates might impact on the data quality to the extent that it would compromise the quality of the data for electoral purposes. That fortunately didn't turn out to be the case, and the data was of sufficient quality to meet those accuracy requirements, but there were other concerns, and I'll just talk briefly about those. So one of the concerns raised by the panel is that if you think about the previous slide and the very low Māori and Pacific collection response rates, what do you do when you've got a data gap that big? If you leave the data in that form, you're going to have massive holes and the data will basically be unusable. So the only real option, apart from not releasing any data that Stats New Zealand had, was to find the data from somewhere else. So what happened effectively was the extensive use of alternative government data. And of course, for those groups that had the lowest response rates, the use of alternative government data to fill the gaps was much more extensive. So one of the concerns raised by the data quality panel in the report was around the issue of a kind of cultural license and social license to use alternative government data that extensively to fill the census data gaps. And social license is this idea that the public, in the data context or the census context, that there's a sufficient degree of comfort that the data can be used in that way. and the data panel wasn't convinced or hadn't seen evidence to support Stats New Zealand having a strong social license to use the data in that way for the census, but particularly for Maori and Pacific people who are most affected by the census and having to use those other data forms. So that was one of the issues raised in the report. The second major finding was that the panel downgraded the rating, the quality rating of the ethnicity data from high quality to moderate quality, and found that the quality of the ethnicity data generally reduced as the level of ethnic specificity and spatial specificity increased. So simply put, as the ethnicity data became more specific or more granular, the quality reduced. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And the third key finding from that data quality panel report was that Stats New Zealand had not met its treaty obligations with its failure to produce data of a sufficient quality, iwi data of a sufficient quality to enable it to be released as official data or official statistics. So Stats New Zealand had already indicated that they would not be releasing iwi data. The panel supported that decision because the panel felt that iwi data was not of a sufficient quality because of the poor collection response rate. And the main thing there is that because the census is the only source of comprehensive, reliable iwi data, there was nowhere else to go. So there were no other alternative data sets from which to draw iwi data and to plug those missing data gaps. So just to show you a table about ethnicity data in the 2018 census, and to be clear about what those data sources were. So here we've just got the European, this is the high level, level 1 European grouping, and then the Māori grouping as well. You can see there the 2018 census form for the European group. 88.5% of the data came from the actual 2018 census form. For Māori, it was only 71% of the data in the final census data set came from the 2018 form. In terms of the 2013 census, 7% of European data came from historic census data, and for Māori it was 15%, so that's very significant. That's in the final census data set for the ethnicity, Māori ethnicity variable. 15% comes from historic census forms through data linkage. Admin data, 4% for European, 13% for the Māori ethnic group, again very significant, and that came from the Department of Internal Affairs birth registration, and then Ministry of Education data as well. And then there were different forms of probabilistic and Kansas imputation, but which was very small. So for the most part, the alternative data came from old census forms in 2013 and also admin data sources. So some of the limitations that came from the report, and this is really important for Māori, is that because of this very significant change in census methodology and the use of alternative sources, the 2018 census data is not comparable with previous census data. So we're looking at kind of time series analysis and trying to understand, as a demographer, population change over time. Being able to compare 2018 census data with previous data is a very fraught exercise, and in the report says should be undertaken with extreme caution. So in a way, this adds a layer of kind of trickiness to working with census data, which for some users will be a barrier and requires an additional sort of level of technical proficiency. Secondly, that household and family data will generally be of low quality, and that will be looked at more in the second report from the panel. This is really important in the context of a lot of the public policies that are being developed. If we think about the kind of wellbeing budget and the focus now on child wellbeing, of course, children live in households, they live in families, they live in whānau. So when the quality of that data is compromised, that will have implications for the ability to generate high quality insights and robust evidence base relating to families in whānau. And the third point was that because 8% of the population could not be placed back into a specific dwelling, that dwelling's information will also be incomplete. Okay, so I just want to end very quickly with talking a little bit about Māori data sovereignty, kind of as a segue from the census. So I talked earlier about Te Mana Rarunga, and that's the Māori Data Sovereignty Network. And there's a website that you can go to, there's a URL down the bottom, there's also the Twitter account. So basically, TMR is an advocacy network advocating for Māori data rights and interests, for data governance, for data storage and security, and for data access and control. One of the questions that comes up quite a lot is, well, okay, well then what's Māori data? And the TMR definition of that's pretty simple, and that's really information or knowledge in a digital or digitizable form that is about or from Māori peoples and environments, regardless of who controls it. So Māori data can be self-generated from iwi or Māori organisations and businesses. It can be about Māori and generated by others. So the Census is a key example of that. And it can also be data about Māori resources. For example, whenua Māori that's generated by Māori entities or by others as well. So all of that is Māori data, which is quite a broad concept. One of the TMR has published online, if you go to the website, you can see the Māori data sovereignty principles. We don't have time to go over all of those today, but I think one that's probably most germane, particularly to the 2018 census and the concerns around cultural license and decisions made around methodologies in the absence of Māori data governance, is this concept of rangatiratanga or authority. And these are the three sub-principles that TMR has produced. And I think the first one, control, is really important, that Māori have an inherent right to exercise control over Māori data and Māori data ecosystems. And this includes the right to around creation, collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, security, dissemination, use and misuse of Māori data. So that's a long list of rights and responsibilities that comes under Māori data governance. I guess is a one mechanism of control, and I think Kirikowhai might talk a little bit more about that in her talk on iwi data. 1.3 there I think is also very important. This is around self-determination. And this is particularly important in the context of Census 2018 not producing official iwi data. So Māori having the right to data that is relevant and empowers sustainable self-determination and effective self-governance. And of course, iwi data is absolutely crucial in that regard. And it's really raised the question of now I think is, well, what kind of system is best fit for purpose moving ahead? There's a lot of innovation happening around data ecosystems. Is a method that's always been used necessarily the right method moving ahead for iwi and for te ao Māori? And so I just want to finish up talking a little bit about the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and the Indigenous Data Sovereignty movement worldwide. So a lot of the issues that are being raised in the context of Census 2018 are actually issues that are also being talked about in other Indigenous contexts, and the sort of advocacy for Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance to be realised in other contexts where people have similar issues. So recently this Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, was launched, and they have a website as well, and you can see that down the bottom, the URL. And one of the key things that was at the launch, one of the key initiatives that was launched as well are these key principles of Indigenous data governance, which are, I think, quite useful for thinking about the context of Aotearoa moving ahead as well. And these key principles stand for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethics. So the first one around collective benefit is around data ecosystems being designed to function to enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from data. The second one, authority to control, is really about recognising the rights and interests of Indigenous people over their data and having authority to control how that data are collected and used. And one mechanism for that, of course, is data governance. The third one, responsibility, is really the responsibility of those working with Indigenous data and the responsibilities they have to share that data with Indigenous peoples to enable their own self-determination. And the fourth one is really around the ethical use of data, and that the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples should be at the forefront of any of those decisions that are made around Indigenous data. So I think I'll wrap it up there, Kim. I can see you're back online now, and then we can have any pārtai and question time and hand it over to Kirikowhai Ngāmi ki a koutou.
Oh, ngā mihi ki a koe, Tahu. Apologies to everyone. Yes, laid plans, all the tech was working till about 10 minutes before going live. So again, I'd just like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us this morning and acknowledge all the community groups and NGOs from Kia ora Kirikowhai. I can introduce you now because I'm online. So Kirikowhai Mikaere is tūhaurangi and Ngāti Whakaue and a leading Māori data and information specialist. Focuses on harnessing information to empower iwi and hapū and whānau and community development. She's a consultant with more than 15 years experience of advising ministers, government agencies, tribal, community and private sector organisations with regards to practical statistical analysis and innovative place-based data solutions. She's had a bicultural education and upbringing. I think our fathers were friends, extensive technical training and hands-on experience with diverse communities. Kirikowhai brings a unique perspective to development opportunities, and she's also currently a technical advisor to the iwi Chairs Forum, the Data Leadership Group, and a future director of the State Sector on Te Māngai Pāho Board, and deputy chair of Māori Hauora provider Manaaki Ora Trust. So kia ora Kirikowhai, awesome to have you with us this morning.
Ka pai, tēnā koutou, heuri tēnei no te waka o Te Arawa, ko tūhaurangi me Ngāti Whakaue o Kuiwi. Tēnei te tukumihi kia koutou te hunga mā takitaki, ko Kirikowhai Mikaere tōku ingoa. He kairaranga au I te raraunga, me ki I'm a translator of data and work every day in the data space with our iwi and Māori organisations. I want to mihi to Kim and the community research organisation for allowing us the opportunity to share our whakaaro on this space, which I think is a really important space for our people. And I want to also mihi to my colleague Tahu, who got it right the first time and has a really good computer, obviously, with good audio, better than mine. I'm going to share this kōrero really from the perspective of a Māori data practitioner. And in doing that, I would really like to ground my kōrero with this picture first. And I often do this when I give kōrero on Māori data and Māori data sovereignty, just to show that this picture here is taken at a Māori Data Futures hui held at Victoria University in our whare Te Tumu Herenga Waka. And I use this picture to show people that this is I guess, a representation of one of our original data repositories. So if you have the particular skills, the pukenga, you can translate the data in these whare, in the whakairo, in the tukutuku panels, into information, into kōrero, into waiata, into haka. And really, I want to ground my kōrero in that because data is not a new space for Māori. We have long been data warriors. And really, the conversation about Māori data sovereignty is because of the evolving digitisation of data. But we have models, we have had ways of transmitting data, and this is about us just transitioning into that new space. I want to discuss today the role of data in iwi development, primarily to give context to the impact of the 2018 census for iwi, and then give some of my thoughts on where to from here. The role of data in iwi development is really important in how we exercise our tino rangatiratanga, and it's vital to empowering transformation for our people, for our place, and for our future. When I talk about the role of data in iwi development for our people, the primary question by most iwi is who and where are our people and how are they connecting with their identity? And identity at an individual level, but also identity at a collective level and all of the components that are associated with that. Identity for iwi is incredibly fundamental. And really no one else's place to have mana over except for us. And so people think that we should be happy with just Māori ethnic data. But actually our iwi leaders, our iwi decision makers need relevant data so they can make decisions and act on those decisions. And an example of this is over the years, iwi have been making their own investments in different areas. And if I take Te Reo Māori as an example, there are iwi who are developing their own Te Reo Māori strategies and investing in, I guess, the revitalization of their language. And they need iwi-specific data to be able to, one, understand the state that they're in at the moment, but also, more importantly, measure the impact of the investments that they're making in those areas. So iwi data around our people is incredibly important. Also for our place and understanding the area that we share kaitiakitanga over. And the example here I've got is from a project by Ngāti Rangi and called the Ruapehu Whānau Transformation Project with the communities of Raitihi, Ohakune and Wauru. And this project is based on what I call a whenua framework, so koro Ruapehu, and the framework that he already shows around development. And the importance of this is understanding that as iwi, we're also interested in data about all of our place and the people who reside in our place and across areas, as well as environmental and cultural. We're also interested in education, employment, housing, health, social, and really everything in our place so we can be kaitiaki of our place and all of those who reside in our place.
Yeah.
Data also plays a really important role in the decisions that iwi need to make about the future and how we design our own development and not just consume whatever data people tell us and tell us these are the pathways that you need to pursue in terms of your development. And really, quite importantly, iwi are really strongly wanting to measure towards our aspirations and not just focus in on the states of deprivation and desperation that the current data and data sets collect about us. This small graphic here is called, from a project by 5 iwi in the Rangitike. So Ngāti Wairiki, Ngāti Apa, Ngāti Hauiti, Ngāti Tamakōperi, Ngāti Whitikaupeka and Ngāti Ohuake came together as a collective and really wanted to try to get more robust data to help them make future decisions about their people. And so this is an iwi designed information framework called Te Kite Tū Ātia. Crosses 5 domains: cultural, social, economic, environmental, and peoples. And we've called it peoples because, as I said, one of the primary information needs and data needs for iwi is around their people. Where are they? Who are they? How are they connecting to identity? So this framework lays out all of the data needs across those 5 domains, the sectors that are under those domains, and most importantly, towards the goal, the ultimate goal of whānau well-being and the dimensions of that goal, which are how the data to be able to exercise kaitiakitanga and rangatiratanga, the data to understand how people are strengthening their identity and connection, and the data to understand opportunities of empowerment and enablement so that the ultimate goal of whānau well-being can be realised. And the little formula that we have at the bottom of this graphic usually is iwi information plus iwi analysis equals better iwi futures. So all of that really is about understanding the context of the importance of iwi data and so therefore the impact of the 2018 census. On the 29th of April this year, Statistics New Zealand released a media release around the data, the 2018 data, and stating that the iwi data will not be released as official statistics. So that primarily came from the result of such a low response rate for Māori, the lowest they've ever had of around 68%. And also their statement that across the data, the government data ecosystem, the other iwi collections were not of a suitable quality to help them fill those gaps. What we know from a recent report that Statistics New Zealand released is the value of census to Māori is valued at over $500 million. When they carried out a similar exercise for the value of census to New Zealand, it was valued at, I think, close to $1 billion. But probably of more relevance is the ratio that for every $1 spent, New Zealanders get a value of $6, but for Māori, for every $1 spent, we get a value of $8 from the census. And that's a really conservative number, because it's primarily based on that valuation on the allocation of government funds based on the Māori ethnic population. It recognises that it hasn't been able to value the Māori descent population and the value of having the electoral boundaries based on that, and nor is it able to at this time value the iwi data and how iwi are using that. They, I think, are hoping to try to do that in later phases. So even the $500 million is still quite a conservative, but a pretty big value in terms of what the impact of this 2018 census for Māori and for iwi. I guess for iwi, the impact is, this has been really the most comprehensive key data source from government for iwi. The majority of iwi data in one place, and for nearly 3 decades, it's been our primary source of iwi data from the government. So we have pretty much had all of our eggs in one basket, and that basket has been dropped. And so there are huge gaps for iwi and for iwi decision makers. There are huge gaps in the relevant data for us to be able to make decisions currently, for us to be able to make future decisions. And also there are big implications on the time series of data. I often talk about one of the biggest values of the census is that, unlike other sample surveys or data collections undertaken across government that really just look at sectors of the community, the census is everybody and every household. And so it makes people visible, more visible than any other data collection across government. And so the fact that there's been a huge undercount of Māori and a huge non-response rate, but also that they're going to be unable to produce at this stage official statistics for iwi, means we will be invisible. We're invisible in that really important data collection. We're invisible in that data source for decisions that are made across government. What was really disheartening was the fact that the system could not respond for iwi. So for their Te Tiriti partners, the whole of government system was unable to respond to provide the data. And that really, I guess that means that we're unable to make, we're unable to track trends for our iwi who have been using data. We're unable also, unfortunately, to be able to provide iwi with data who only recently went on the iwi classification of Statistics New Zealand. Some of them have been waiting for over 30 years to get on that classification. This was the first time they were going to be able to get data, and they're not going to be able to get any data out of this census. As iwi though, we're not just interested in the data for the decisions that we make, we're also interested in the data that's used in decisions that are made about us. And so when they value or they try to look at measuring the value of census around the allocation of funds, what we know is they're not going to be able to do that for the allocation of funds around iwi. And so those iwi who are going through the settlement process at this time, the reality is the census and that data is often used as a part of the quantum in settlements. And so whilst it seems like it might just be a one-off collection, it will probably have intergenerational impact on the measurements and on a really important source of information for our people that we will have to track and measure over time. So it's, I mean, I'm not trying to overstate. I think, in fact, I'm understating the impact of the 2018 census for iwi, and we will just have to really monitor that. And what we're going to have to do is look at some more innovative solutions around what happens going forward. And I think probably one of the biggest ones is that we not have all our eggs in one basket anymore. So these are my thoughts on where to from here. I think the biggest one is that iwi need to be a part of sort of the co-development and the co-design of redesigning a more dynamic data ecosystem for Aotearoa. And so this is, you know, a really big non-response rate by particular communities, but we saw, you know, there are other factors that impact on the collection of data, and the 2011 earthquake, or the earthquake in Christchurch, resulted in the 2011 census being pushed out to 2013. So I think New Zealand itself, Aotearoa, needs a more dynamic data ecosystem to be able to respond to all of these different factors, and there'll be new ones that come up over time that impact on collection, and how do we have a system that can be more responsive and dynamic no matter what changes are happening around us. But I do think that iwi need to be a part of the co-design of that. I think there has to be greater investment in our communities to collect our own data with others for us, and I think there has to be a move away from, in that sense, building little empires, and really sort of towards a more distributed network and ecosystem. And so for us, for iwi, for Māori, one of the biggest things we need to do is really future-proof our data capability and capacity. We need to invest in building Māori data capability and Māori data capacity and infrastructure. I often say that we are some of the biggest data providers, iwi. We're pretty happy to give away data all the time. We very rarely question that, but we need to move away from just being data providers, and even from being data consumers and just consuming whatever people tell us in terms of our areas of priority or our areas of need, and really move towards being data designers, and in a way that gives us equal explanatory power and recognises the mana orite that we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think our rangatahi ILG put it a nice way. They said we need data tiratanga. And so I think these are my thoughts on where to from here in terms of the impact of the 2018 census for Māori. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koe Kirikowhai. Look, you've raised some really, you know, timely and huge issues here. I guess even attending the Wairoa Tātou Huia Iwi engagement hui on the weekend, there were lots of questions about how do we engage as taurehere back home, and what are if a lot of iwi are interested in collecting data, so how they think about collecting that. Do you think there's opportunities for us to really, I guess, as iwi, perhaps collectivise our approach to data collection, so that we're not all trying to kind of, I don't know, build the behemoth?
Definitely. I think I don't think we should try to do things in silo, nor do I think we should try to necessarily replicate the systems that are already out there. I think there's real benefit in us coming together and leveraging off some of the capability that we have. I think, you know, and this is my personal opinion, I think we currently have limited capability in this space. So if we can collectivize that and then build on top of that, I think that's going to mean a faster way for us to develop in a more cohesive manner. I think the other benefit of us coming together is that we have a standardized way of collecting and monitoring, and have our own robust system around data.
Yeah. Are there some short-term kind of things that are happening, perhaps with Stats New Zealand, that are seeking to kind of remedy the lack of data for us?
Definitely. So quite recently, the Data Iwi Leadership Group, and I lead the technicians for the Data Iwi Leadership Group under the Iwi Cheers Forum, we have signed a mana orite relationship agreement with Statistics New Zealand. We have some agreed deliverables and agreed goals, and most importantly, some agreed principles around how we will make decisions together in an operational sense, and primarily around some focus areas. So the first focus area is on really investigating the 2018 census data for iwi to see if anything can be salvaged, but also looking at co-designing and co-developing some more innovative solutions. So Statistics New Zealand will look at that, and the Data ILG will look at that, and then we'll come together with both of our pilots to see which ones might be most successful in the short term to try to scale up. We're also, a part of that agreement is the co-design of Māori data governance across the government data ecosystem. So that will start quite soon. And then there's also a project looking at some specialised data collections for iwi and how we get the capability that sits within Statistics New Zealand to support iwi to be able to do that for ourselves. So those are in the short term what some, I guess, mitigations that we've been negotiating with Statistics New Zealand. And then lastly, we are really keen on and have been contributing towards some of the early thinking around the Census 2023 and feeding into the budget bid process around that.
Yeah, I guess, you know, you've raised some really interesting points around how we're measuring information. I know even some of the whānau ora outcomes kind of measurements tend to look at, you know, deficit kind of measurements for our people. So, you know, is there much work going on in terms of, actually you showed a couple of models of looking at measuring those positive developments for whānau. Do you see this aligning much with some of the government thinking around wellbeing? And is there a chance that we can better use, you know, data or data perspectives to influence how wellbeing is measured?
I think we have to. So at the moment, there is a lot of rhetoric and aspiration to be collecting wellbeing and also connected to the Living Standards Framework for Treasury. The reality is the underlying data is still all very deficit and deprivation focused. And that's been a lot of our conversations with the Crown has been, it's not necessarily well-being that you're measuring, but you're measuring the lack, or you know, the lack of well-being. It's not equity necessarily that you're measuring, it's inequity, because that's the data that is there. So how can we start to have a conversation about redesigning some of the data collection? We recognize you have to understand you know, some of that data has to be collected around need, but it's how do we balance that out with actually data that helps us measure towards where we want to go. And I think in the conversations we've had with ministers, they recognise that what you measure, you manage. And so at the moment, we're really just measuring and managing, you know, sort of deprivation, and measuring and managing sort of need and welfare. And so how do we start to collect different sets of data? There's a project that Statistics New Zealand were leading around indicators Aotearoa. So looking at the top 100 sort of wellbeing indicators, and in discussions that we had with them, they have invested in another Māori group looking at standing up an equivalent sort of indicators for Māori, and they might be similar or they might be different, but recognising that you know, we can have our own mana over what we determine are indicators for well-being.
Kia ora. I've just kind of got a question around capability and capacity. Can you just talk a little bit about how you came to be doing the work that you're doing and what your pathway was, and also, you know, how can we encourage our kids to really get involved in this space? Because I think some of this also links to, you know, some of the ways in which data collection is programmed, and there's been a lot of discussion about whose values are inputting into things like AI and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So it would be good to hear what your journey was.
Yeah. So I have actually always been interested in maths and stats from a very young age. I think really a lot of, we get told a lot of the time that it's not an area for us, but like I said, and you know, when I very first started the presentation, actually for me, a lot of maths is just about patterns, and we are very good at understanding patterns and the translation of those patterns. And so I did a science degree in mathematics, and I have a commerce degree in economics. And I also, while I was going through university, they had a Māori statistics scholarship. And so I would go into work in the holidays at Statistics New Zealand under Whetū Wereta and the then Māori Stats Unit, which is no longer, unfortunately. And then when I graduated from university, they actually started a new program at Stats NZ, a leadership development program. And so I came in on that. I think there were 10 of us. We were the first intake. And I got to work across the 3 different offices of Statistics New Zealand in Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland, and on a number of different projects that ranged from Māori business statistics, environmental statistics, economic statistics. I actually went out and was a district supervisor for the 2006 census, so had a big team of about 20 enumerators for the Wanganui area where I grew up and up the river. And then I came back in and I analysed and produced the iwi profiles, iwi statistics, the Māori descent information, the Te Reo Māori statistics, and then I went to be the private secretary statistics in Parliament for a few years, came out of there and was the senior advisor across the official statistics system. So that's all of the government data system adhere to particular rules, particularly if they're tier 1 statistics, so the most important stats. And then from there, I went to do my most important mahi and I became a mama. And while I was on leave, I started working with iwi, my iwi, to help them in this space, look at data and using that more robustly. And so for the last sort of 8, my son is 8, so 9 years, I have been working primarily with iwi and Māori organisations and Māori communities, trying to use the skills I have acquired to help us make more informed decisions across the important areas of development that we have. And so that's a pathway that I've sort of taken to get to where I am. I'm passionate about trying to help our people in our development, and I'm more and more conscious that it's a pretty small quantitative Māori community, quantitative analysis Māori community, and I'm keen to try to grow that and grow more capability in that area.
Aroha mai. So as parents, have you got, is there other ways, should we be encouraging our children to stay in maths, and I don't know, is there any special support for, I guess, kids who show an interest or aptitude? For Māori kids, are there like Māori math camps or?
No, but that sounds awesome. We should have some Māori math camps. Particularly my son, he loves stats, and I have equation books that I do up for him and that he sort of does while he's waiting for mum at different hui instead of playing on his device. But I guess the other thing is I would be really vigilant, and I know that a colleague of mine has done some study around we get weeded out really early on of this pathway, and that's not and that's really just bias and prejudice. We don't get the opportunity to go into the classes, particularly when you go into high school, around these kind of subjects, around mathematics, around statistics. We get weeded out into other streams, and then that really limits the pathway for us. And so I think that would probably be my number one thing, as parents, be vigilant about the school weeding our children out of these opportunities, and also just debunk the myth that this is not an area for us. We are definitely mathematicians.
Yeah.
A lot of our stuff around, and I try to say this to my children and others, a lot of our waka, a lot of our navigation, a lot of our whare, our whakairo, our tukutuku, our whāriki, it's all maths. It's all different patterns. It's science and it's maths. And so this is how we have ways of explaining and understanding the world, and they are valid ways.
Kia ora Kirikowhai. Can you just tell us a little bit about Te Wehi, about your company, and you know, why you started it up and kind of who some of your working partners are at the moment.
So Te Wehi Development by Design is really, I started it because I wanted us to be able to design our own development. I have a website, I think www.developmentbydesign.co.nz, and it's really just trying to provide some indigenous innovation options, some statistical analysis and statistical advice to iwi, to Māori groups, some being sort of different models around sort of stats, story solutions. And at the moment, my sister works quite closely with me, and she implemented the Ruapehu Whānau Transformation Project.
Okay.
And then I have other colleagues that I bring in for particular things. So some all Māori, and sort of there's a couple of analysts, not very many of us, and so come in to help me do an analysis around really detailed, in particular, iwi statistical profiles, and then provide. At the moment, we're working on some outcomes frameworks for some of our Māori land trusts, and working with some of our Māori hauora providers and helping them with just a more cohesive data strategy. And then also, as I mentioned, working with quite a few iwi throughout the motu, helping them understand really just like what their information needs are, if they can get that information from somewhere else so they don't have to reinvent the wheels, and then also providing them with options around how to collect that data for themselves.
Got one final question. Thank you, Kirikowhai. In terms of data literacy, I guess there's two things. One is, what can we do as individuals to improve our data literacy around these sorts of issues, and about our kind of, I guess, our engagement with data, and also, you know, are there some kind of things that you think we need to be doing to improve collective data literacy, and what might some of those things be?
So I think just at an individual level, the biggest thing is not being afraid to question the data. I find a lot of our people are afraid to question things, and because the true value of data comes from understanding the context, and nobody understands our context better than us. And so when people put statistics or figures in front of us, just because they're stats, we don't question them. But if you stop and think about it in the context of the mahi that you do or in your community, even if you don't know the right number, you know if that's wrong or not. But we often don't question, well, actually, where's that from? People will just chuck out stats. One of the biggest examples of that will be next year, come election time, people chuck out stats left, right and centre for, you know, around Te Ao Māori. And I'm sitting there going, there's no data collection for that. What are you talking, like people just making some stuff up to. So that's probably one of my biggest things, is don't be afraid to question it. And I mean, at the very least, at least you learn where that came from, and where you might be able to source that data for yourself. I think collectively, I'm really keen to try to work with our community, like organisations that are already in our communities, whether they be wānanga or others, to look at how we start to sort of build from the ground up our data literacy and our data capability. There are groups looking at how we can get funding to be able to do that, to even just hold some small wānanga in the first instance, and really just sort of trying to share what Māori data sovereignty is, what people are trying to do, share some of the stories, and then also where you can get even something as simple as, here's how you can access the data that's already available. One of the things that we were able to do under the relationship with the Data Iwi Leadership Group and Statistics New Zealand is, for the first time, get access for iwi, free access for iwi to all of their census data. Admittedly not 2018 yet, because it's still in a state of flux, but 2013 and back. And I would really encourage any iwi who might be listening to this to contact Statistics New Zealand and ask for your data, because for the first time it is free. And to give context to that, in the past, when I do an individual iwi request for data, it costs around $6,000 to $8,000. And so just even knowing that that's available and how you can access that. Even that's, you know, something that we need to do at a collective level, is to try to get out there and share a greater awareness around what is happening, and also how important it is going forward to understand data is effectively the new oil. It is a massive strategic asset, but it is also going to be, if not already, one of the biggest economic assets in the world. And so how do we as iwi and how do we as Māori have greater awareness of that and greater mana over that? And I guess take from some of the learnings of our journey thus far, that we don't just give such an important resource up.
So we've got some great questions coming through, and one of them is, how should Te Mana Rāraunga principles interact with the Privacy Act?
No, it's not. So one of the key things that TMR has advocated for is that most privacy frameworks and regulatory approaches are based on a very kind of Anglo notion of privacy, which is all about individual privacy. And so even in Europe, the GDPR is all focused on personal data, privacy rights and control. That doesn't really work in a Te Ao Māori context. I mean, obviously as individuals, we have individual data privacy concerns and data privacy rights, and that's fine, and that can be covered off by the legislation. But there's this other dimension which actually is nearly always absent, and this is collective privacy rights. And so what does collective privacy look like? How do you give due regard to that? How do you even operationalize that within the law and within regulatory frameworks, and also in ethical approaches? And I mean, there's two obvious examples in Te Ao Māori where individual data privacy rights really make no sense. One is if you're talking about whakapapa data, because encoded in each of those data points is information about somebody else. And the individual really, so an individual may consent for that whakapapa information to be shared, but actually it requires the consent of a whole bunch of other people whose information is included in there as well. So just for that sort of information, you need a more collective approach. We've been trying to work through that in one of the projects we're doing with Ngāti Tipa in Waikato, where we're reconstructing our ancestral population and digitising that in a whakapapa database. And what's become really clear is that you need to have the tikanga sorted out. The tikanga comes before the technology, and a key part of that is around privacy rights and access. And it really comes back to the whānau, how they decide how they want that data to be used. And you have to have a very sort of dynamic permissions system embedded in there to enable different sorts of rights and different sorts of privacy rights to kick in at different levels, depending on what the data is and how much of it's included in there. Now, in a government context, there's really been no regard. It's all about individuals, and simply de-identifying individual level data doesn't really get around some of those issues. So, and most of the time, it's not individual. People aren't not interested in individuals; they're interested in groups. So even if you de-identify the individual level data, you're telling a story about a group for the most part. And some of those particularly subgroups may be heavily stigmatized as a consequence of the data analysis.
One of the questions here is from Michael, and he's asking, how do you see Te Mana Rāraunga working most effectively with Ministry of Health to drive Māori data sovereignty? And Tahu, do you want to answer that?
Sure. Look, I think TMR is one key interest group or stakeholder in the data game. There are others as well, but I think from a TMR perspective, one thing that's absolutely critical when dealing with health data is that there is robust Māori data governance over Māori data, and that happens at the very highest levels. That it's informed by best practice from here and from around the world. That it has a very strong treaty lens, that it has a very strong equity lens, that it has a very strong well-being lens, and that it's principle-based. And so, what Kiri said before is that we want to be data designers, and to design data systems that actually work for us instead of against us. There's a long legacy of data working against us, or at least not in our well-being interests. And so data governance is a really important mechanism for that. And I think it's one that the key agencies should absolutely have in place. And there was talk about having a cross-government Māori data governance initiative being set up. And I think I see a lot of merit in that, because it's increasingly happening all across the sector, not just in health. not just in education, but everywhere, the secondary use of linked data. So that data governance is absolutely vital, but I think there's other aspects that also need to be attended to. And as Kiri noted, the investment in community capability and capacity is absolutely essential. Otherwise, iwi, hapū, Maori organisations and entities will forever be dependent on Crown agencies to do the right thing with our data, and we know that that doesn't always happen, despite best intentions.
All right. Holly Ware's got a quick question. How many members are part of Te Mana Rauronga?
So it's a diffuse network. We have a core working group, Te Pokapū, and I think there's 10 people on that central working group. But TMR is a network. People don't actually join as a formal membership, but the directory, which is also on the TMR website, the TMR directory has more than, I think it's 120 people on that directory, and the email list has a couple of hundred.
So there's another question here from a digital identity transition program, something or other, who said they're wondering if you've been engaging with any of the departments like the Ministry of Justice about collective privacy or about the collective privacy model.
Yeah, so TMR has had some conversations with different agencies around collective privacy, and there's also the privacy bill that's in chain. That is becoming an increasing focus, particularly in the context as more data is being linked, and integrated and shared. The issue of collective privacy becomes even more important. What's one of the challenges here is that there hasn't been a great deal of thought, even within the legal profession, really, to thinking about how you articulate and operationalise the concept of collective privacy. My sense is that probably that's going to be left up to Māori to articulate and to design. I think we're actually well placed to, like as Kirikowhai said right at the opening of her talk, we have a long history of dealing with data. It wasn't digitized data, but we have tikanga developed over hundreds of years on the ethical use of collectively held knowledge. And what are the principles that we bring to bear on how that information is used, who it's held by, and how it's disseminated. So we have long tikanga around that use of collectively held knowledge. And it's really, to me, it's about how do you design the data systems, and that includes the principles and the governance processes to actually leverage off the tikanga and the knowledge that we already have around this about the ethical use of data and build that into the system. So, I mean, really the same as for collective privacy. But first, the initial groundwork has to be done on how you actually define those concepts, and then how you actually operationalize them into kind of a regulatory framework, and then how that gets implemented. And there's a lot of work to do there. And I really wouldn't leave it up to government departments to figure that one out.
I'd just like to thank you all for attending, and in particular thanking Tahu and Kirikowhai for their time today and sharing of their knowledge. We are keen to do a re-record of Kirikowhai's presentation to make sure you get the best possible audio quality as possible. So we'll be sorting that out in the next couple of days. If you'd like to be notified when we're broadcasting our next webinar, join our Facebook page and Community Research Discussion Group. And you can email communications@communityresearch.org.nz to get up to keep up to date with our e-news. We've got a couple more webinars planned before Christmas. One's with the recipients of Te Auaha Pitomata, our New and Emerging Researcher Awards, and they'll be sharing their work with us in November. And we're also hoping to book a very exciting, provocative international guest who will be offering insight to Pākehā researchers wanting to improve their cultural literacy and competency. So subscribe to keep up to date on that one. Thanks again to our wahine toa, and to all of you for joining us in this community research webinar. Kia kaha, kia toa, kia manawa nui, kia pai tō wiki, mauri ora.